On Wednesday of this last week, we were in Colorado Springs and going up Pikes Peak. On Thursday, we were in southern Wyoming, hand-feeding bison in the snow. I mention that because the sermon preparation may have suffered somewhat in the process. So what I offer are a few thoughts gathered along the I-25. You know, in the very last scene of Matthew's Gospel, the disciples, all of them, are back in Galilee, and when Jesus appears to them on the mountaintop, another mountaintop, we're told that they fell down and worshipped him, although they doubted. It's an extraordinary, and perhaps it's meant to be an encouraging detail, that having experienced all of Jesus' ministry and teaching, and having witnessed so many healings and multiplications and exorcisms, the transfiguration, the resurrection, they still weren't sure. And so whatever happened at the transfiguration, it was meant to be part of a much larger and longer teaching strategy that really was not complete until Jesus had gone. The disciples were meant to take things away from all of these encounters and eventually to piece them together. This is not Jesus showing off. Moses and Elijah's presence is meant to be an essential part of the lesson they will learn. We all know that Moses is the great lawgiver, and Elijah is often referred to as the greatest of the prophets. The books of the law, which tradition has that Moses authored, the Pentateuch, the Torah, comprise, as we know, the first major section of the Bible, and another major section as the prophetic literature. And so here, the two personalities identified with those two massive slabs of the Bible are in conversation with Jesus. And it is in that conversation that the glory of God quivers, radiates, shines out. Now, in every age and in every society, law represents stability, predictability. It articulates and enshrines agreed upon values and procedures. It gives structure and it gives protection. Moses represents that solid core within the people and within the tradition of his people. But, as we know only too well, the law can be overridden, it can be forgotten, it can be ignored, it can be applied indiscriminately, it can be even used to subvert and betray the very purposes for which it exists. We portray the statue of justice blindfolded. And there's a great danger, there's a virtue and a flaw in that. Because it can become inhuman and take no account of individual circumstances. And so Elijah stands with all of the prophets at one remove from the law, sometimes demanding greater fidelity to it, and sometimes demanding that the observation of the law must be leavened by mercy and by compassion. And this was, of course, at the very heart of Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees. Both of them were insisting on fidelity to the law, but they understood something quite different by that. Jesus understood law as covenant, as something far richer and more nuanced than simply keeping a set of rules, insisting sometimes that you actually had to break the rules in order to observe the law. And that type of tension is not restricted to Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees. We live that conflict every day. It continues in our courtrooms. Justice is not ever as simple as simply following a set of rules. Moses and Elijah represent these two fundamental strands in all of human society. The ongoing drama of immigration in this country has Moses on one side, insisting on the inviolability of the law, that the law must be applied equally to all, it must be observed faithfully, that making exceptions is not fair. And then on the other hand, you've got Elijah agreeing with all of that in principle, but reminding the audience that there are lives at stake here. There are families with children. There are people who are being sent back to persecution and even certain death. These cases must be treated with compassion, with mercy. And they're both right. And so in between them, in conversation with them, stands Jesus, saying on one hand in chapter 5 of Matthew's Gospel that not one jot, not one stroke of the law will disappear until it is fulfilled. But then in chapter 9 saying, go and learn what it means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. So perhaps nowhere more clearly than in Matthew's Gospel do we see Jesus constantly, insistently trying to stitch together what should never have been torn apart. The covenant has been broken and divided into justice on one hand and mercy on the other, two which should never have been separated. Last Sunday we raised the topic of moral discernment and the need for every one of us to make difficult decisions between competing goods or occasionally competing evils. And what I want to suggest is that part of the teaching import of the Transfiguration for the disciples, one of the things they are meant to take away from this encounter is that in living a faith-filled life, there will always be tension between fidelity to the law and genuinely doing justice. And that authentic discernment does not, on one hand, seek to abolish the demands of the law, nor does it block its ears to the cries for compassion and for mercy. It's curious that as a nation we are so quick to litigate about displaying the Ten Commandments in public places, but manage to demonstrate a singular lack of interest in whether those commandments are actually lived, translated into public policy or even into civil discourse. We all agree that yes, it's wrong to steal, but it seems that it takes a financial crisis to make us realise how we have structured stealing into our economy and into our culture. As a society, we probably more often mean it's wrong to get caught stealing. It's okay, it's even admirable if you actually manage to get away with it. And so the genuine prophetic voice doesn't say abolish the law, it says stop stealing. We can all agree it's wrong to kill, but then immediately create a list as long as your arm of all the occasions on which we think it's not only permissible, it's actually quite a good idea. Perhaps we wouldn't need to spend $1.5 billion every single day on defence if we weren't quite so comfortable with killing. One glance at our economy's reliance on the arms industry suggests killing is way too much a money spinner to be abolished. And once again, the prophetic voice doesn't say stop exempting yourself from the law, it says try paying attention to it. We can all agree that telling the truth is pretty fundamental to any human relationship and fundamental to the very structure of our society. We cannot function without truth being a plank on which we stand. But our society has clearly developed an uncritical tolerance for lies, and with predictably disastrous consequences. And once again, the prophetic voice doesn't say countenance deceit. It says tell the truth, observe the law. Jesus is to be found between Moses and Elijah, in discussion with both. And where we find Jesus, there we encounter wisdom and wholeness. The Transfiguration is not an extraterrestrial light show that is meant to establish Jesus' credentials. It is a living lesson that is meant for every disciple. The genuine observance of the law demands fidelity to the moral law as well as attentiveness to the demands of people and of mercy. And that reliable discernment is always open to God. That's why the voice of heaven says, "This is my Son, the beloved, listen to him." His very presence demands integrity and instills that sort of balanced reason for which we crave so badly. And the second point that I want to make is that, in this story there are a series of triads, obviously. Triad of Jesus, Moses, Elijah, the triad on the ground of Peter, James, and John. But then there's the less obvious triad of the Trinity. Jesus is transfigured, not because of Moses and Elijah or Peter, James, and John, but because he is in radical communion with the Father, personified by the Spirit. And so this pulsating, dazzling radiance is what the inner life of God looks like, were it to break out. What the disciples see shining out at them is the holiest of all communions. Something that is so charged with life and energy that it shines. And this communion is not a closed loop, and it's not passive. It has embraced Moses and Elijah. It has absorbed the law and the prophets. It is dynamic. It goes on drawing in. And so when Peter and James and John see Moses and Elijah, they glimpse their own future. In the meantime, when Jesus sits at table with them for the last time, at the very end of his physical communion with them, he takes bread and wine and he gives it to them as his body and blood, and he promises that he will be with them forever. And that just as he and the Father are one, so in celebrating this meal, they will be one with him and he with them. Now, in the sacred memory of the disciples, the Transfiguration was not only this burning image of what they could look forward to. It was something that in the Eucharist they already experienced. This Holy Communion that dazzled on table was theirs. This is where and when, yes, in a poor and fractured, fragmented way, you and I receive into our own bodies that glorified body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ that once shone on the table. I think one of the great Americanisms is the expression, "come to Jesus." It's the Urban Dictionary defines come to Jesus as an epiphany in which one realizes the truth of a matter, a sudden intuitive perception of or insight into the reality or essential meaning of something, coming clean, admitting failures, realizing the true weight or impact of a negative situation or fact, acknowledgement that one must get back to core values, a moment of realization, of decision, of truth, of reassessment of priorities, turning point, a life-changing moment. That's not the catechism, that's the Urban Dictionary. So deeply embedded in our culture is this extraordinary awareness and acknowledgement that in the presence of Jesus, there are no lies and there is no possibility of deceiving. In the presence of Jesus, there is truth, there is clarity, there is soul-bearing honesty, and with that, the possibility of radical change. We live in a time and in a nation that so desperately needs to come to Jesus, to have the tattered shreds of our society stitched together again, and honesty and truthfulness and justice and the renunciation of violence restored to our nation, to its discourse, and to our moral reasoning. When the early church had lost sight of the transfigured Christ on table and of the risen one in the upper room, their Lord still came to them as bread and wine among the community of believers. And that Lord is still here to be found. It is where we are reminded of who we are and what we are called to do.